Hello, my sleepy friends. When people imagine the Vikings, they usually picture long ships cutting through icy seas, warriors wearing heavy cloaks, and battles echoing across cold northern landscapes. Yet far away from raids and voyages, the everyday life of Viking families unfolded inside long wooden buildings known as longhouses. And it was inside these buildings that some of the most unusual sleeping habits in medieval Europe developed. Life in Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries was shaped by brutal winters, short daylight hours, and harsh weather that forced people to organize their homes and routines very differently from what modern societies consider normal. Because of these conditions, Viking sleep was not simply about rest. It was deeply connected to survival, warmth, community life, and the rhythm of the northern environment. The Viking longhouse itself explains much about their sleeping habits. These structures were long rectangular buildings made from wood, turf, and stone, often stretching 20 to 40 meters in length. Inside, there were no private bedrooms like modern houses. Instead, the interior space functioned as a shared living environment where families, servants, and sometimes animals lived together under the same roof. Along the walls of the longhouse ran raised wooden platforms covered with furs, wool blankets, and straw bedding. These platforms served as sleeping areas for everyone in the household. At night, the entire family would lie down along these raised benches, wrapped in animal skins to protect themselves from the bitter Scandinavian cold. Because Viking houses had limited insulation and harsh winds could easily seep through wooden walls, sleeping close together was not simply a social habit, but a practical necessity. Body heat helped everyone remain warm during long winter nights that sometimes lasted more than 16 hours in northern regions. Children slept beside parents, servants slept near their masters, and guests often shared the same sleeping platforms. Privacy, as modern societies understand it, did not exist in the Viking world. Sleep was a communal activity shaped by the need for warmth and protection from the cold. Another unusual aspect of Viking sleep involved the central hearth, which burned continuously in the middle of the longhouse. This fire served as the heart of the home, providing light, warmth, and a place to cook food. Smoke from the fire slowly rose toward an opening in the roof, but the ventilation was rarely perfect. As a result, the air inside Viking homes often remained filled with smoke throughout the night. People grew accustomed to sleeping in these smoky environments, their eyes watering slightly as the fire crackled through the darkness. Although uncomfortable by modern standards, this constant fire helped maintain warmth and also discouraged insects from gathering inside the house. The rhythm of Viking sleep was also heavily influenced by the extreme seasonal changes of Scandinavia. During the summer months, daylight in northern regions could last nearly 20 hours, creating an environment where darkness barely appeared at night. Vikings often adjusted their routines to this strange cycle by sleeping in shorter periods rather than maintaining one long, uninterrupted sleep. Work in fields, fishing waters, and forests continued late into the evening because the sun remained visible far longer than in southern Europe. Winter created the opposite challenge. Darkness could stretch for most of the day, and long nights encouraged extended periods of rest. Families often gathered around the fire telling stories, repairing tools, weaving cloth, or carving wood before eventually settling into their sleeping areas. Sleep sometimes came earlier, simply because there was little light available to continue working. Another fascinating feature of Viking sleep involved the idea of segmented sleep. something historians believe was common throughout medieval Europe. Instead of sleeping through the entire night in one continuous period, people often slept in two separate phases. Vikings would fall asleep shortly after darkness settled, wake up in the middle of the night for a period of quiet activity, and then return to sleep until morning. During this waking period, people might check animals, add wood to the fire, speak quietly with family members, or simply sit awake in silence before drifting back to rest. This pattern made sense in a world without artificial lighting. Nights were long and sleep naturally divided into separate cycles. What modern people might consider insomnia was simply a normal part of medieval sleep rhythms. The materials Vikings used for bedding also reflected the environment around them. Straw mattresses were common, but they were covered with furs from animals such as sheep, deer, or bears, depending on the wealth of the household. These furs provided insulation against cold wooden surfaces and could be rearranged easily, depending on how many people were sleeping together. Wealthier families sometimes owned thicker blankets made from woven wool, which retained warmth better than simple straw bedding. Interestingly, archaeologists have found evidence that Vikings often slept with their clothing still on during winter months. Removing layers of wool and fur would expose the body to cold air during the night. So many people simply loosened their belts and cloaks rather than changing into separate sleeping garments. Boots might even remain beside the sleeping platform so they could be quickly worn again if someone needed to step outside into the freezing night. Even the position of sleep mattered in Viking houses. The sleeping platforms along the walls were slightly elevated above the central floor area, which allowed cold air to sink downward, while warmer air from the fire circulated near the sleeping areas. This simple architectural design helped create a more comfortable sleeping environment, despite the harsh climate outside. These strange sleeping habits might seem unusual to modern viewers, but they were perfectly suited to the realities of Viking life. Survival in the far north required cooperation, shared warmth, and flexible routines that adapted to the extreme cycles of daylight and darkness. Inside the longhouse, surrounded by family, firelight, and the quiet sound of wind outside the wooden walls, Viking sleep was not simply rest. It was part of the daily rhythm that allowed their society to endure some of the harshest living conditions in medieval Europe. And as we move deeper into the world of the Vikings, we begin to uncover even more surprising details about how these northern people organized their nights, protected themselves from freezing temperatures, and developed unusual habits that shaped the way they slept through the long centuries of the Viking Age. Inside the Viking longhouse, the night never truly became silent. Even after the fire dimmed and the last conversations faded into quiet whispers, the building itself remained alive with small sounds that shaped the strange sleeping environment of the Viking world. The crackle of burning wood, the slow breathing of dozens of people sharing the same room, the shifting of animals in nearby stalls, and the whistle of wind pushing against wooden walls all blended together into the background of nightly life. For Vikings, sleep was not the isolated, silent experience modern people expect. It was something shared within a living community that rested together beneath one roof. The structure of the longhouse itself played an important role in how Vikings slept. Unlike modern homes with separate bedrooms, the interior of a Viking house was largely one long, open hall. Along both walls were wooden sleeping platforms known as set benches, raised slightly above the floor and covered with layers of straw, wool, and animal skins. These benches stretched along the length of the house, allowing many people to sleep side by side in rows. Each family member or servant typically had a familiar spot along the platform, but space was rarely rigidly assigned. Visitors, travelers, or extended relatives could easily join the household for the night, simply sharing the same sleeping area with the rest of the group. This arrangement created one of the most unusual aspects of Viking sleep: constant communal sleeping. Privacy was almost non-existent. A single household might include parents, children, grandparents, workers, and guests all resting within a few meters of each other. For modern audiences, this might seem uncomfortable, but for Vikings, it created a sense of safety and warmth. In a harsh northern environment where winter storms could isolate farms for weeks, the closeness of the household reinforced bonds between family members and ensured that everyone could be protected during the night. The presence of animals also influenced Viking sleep patterns. In many longhouses, especially smaller rural farms, livestock such as sheep, goats, or even small cattle were sometimes kept in adjoining sections of the same building during winter months. This practice served a practical purpose. Animals produced warmth, and their body heat helped maintain a slightly higher temperature inside the house during freezing nights. While the smell and noise might have been unpleasant by modern standards, Vikings understood that sharing space with animals could help them survive brutal winters. Because Viking homes relied heavily on fire for warmth and cooking, someone in the household often needed to remain partially awake during the night to manage the hearth. Fires could not simply be allowed to burn uncontrollably inside a wooden building. A responsible family member might wake periodically to add fuel, adjust burning logs, or ensure that sparks did not threaten the structure. This responsibility reinforced the pattern of interrupted sleep, where people woke briefly during the night before returning to rest again. Another strange Viking habit involved how they used bed companions not only for warmth, but also for social bonding. Sleeping beside others allowed body heat to circulate under shared furs and blankets, which made nights far more bearable when temperatures dropped far below freezing. Children often slept directly beside parents or siblings, and young warriors or farm workers frequently shared bedding spaces when traveling. This closeness also strengthened trust among members of the household, creating a communal lifestyle where individuals relied on each other for comfort and protection. Seasonal darkness influenced Viking sleep in another unusual way. During the long winters of Scandinavia, daylight sometimes lasted only a few hours. As darkness settled across the landscape, people often spent long evenings indoors before eventually sleeping. These hours were rarely wasted. Families used the time to repair clothing, carve tools, prepare fishing nets, or tell stories passed down through generations. Storytelling became an essential part of Viking culture during these dark evenings. Tales of gods like Odin and Thor, legendary warriors, and distant lands filled the hall as the fire flickered in the center of the room. Eventually, the stories slowed, voices faded, and people gradually settled into their sleeping places along the walls. Yet even then, sleep did not always come immediately. The smoky air, the warmth of the fire, and the presence of others often created a slow drifting transition into rest rather than an abrupt moment of sleep. Some individuals may have remained awake quietly listening to the wind outside, reflecting on the next day's work or the uncertain dangers of the world beyond their village. Interestingly, Viking sagas occasionally mention people waking during the night to observe the sky. In northern regions, the aurora borealis, or northern lights, sometimes illuminated the darkness with strange green and purple glows. Many Vikings believed these lights carried spiritual meaning, perhaps connected to the gods or to the spirits of fallen warriors. Seeing such lights in the middle of the night would have been both mysterious and powerful, adding another layer of wonder to the Viking experience of nighttime. The idea of sleeping through the entire night in one uninterrupted stretch simply did not exist for most Vikings. Instead, sleep flowed naturally with the rhythms of firelight, darkness, and the needs of the household. People drifted into sleep, woke briefly, spoke quietly with neighbors on the sleeping bench, or stepped outside to check animals before returning to their furs once again. In this way, Viking sleep became less like the strict schedules of modern life and more like a slow tide moving in and out with the rhythms of nature. Darkness arrived, rest followed, and the quiet hours of the night passed within the shared warmth of the longhouse as families waited for the pale northern dawn to return. As the long Viking night stretched across the frozen landscapes of Scandinavia, sleep inside the longhouse followed patterns shaped not only by climate, but also by culture, belief, and the constant awareness of danger beyond the walls. Viking communities lived in a world where darkness carried meaning. Night was not merely a time for rest, but a moment when the ordinary world seemed to thin and the mysterious forces of the universe felt closer. Because of this, the way Vikings approached sleep often blended practical survival habits with deep-rooted spiritual beliefs. One important feature of Viking sleep involved the placement of individuals within the longhouse. The sleeping benches that lined the walls were not completely random in how they were used. The most respected members of the household, often the head of the family and their closest relatives, slept near the center of the building where the fire burned. This central area remained the warmest part of the house and offered protection from drafts entering through doors or gaps in the walls. Younger workers, servants, or visitors sometimes slept farther toward the ends of the hall, where the temperature could drop noticeably during winter nights. This subtle arrangement of sleeping positions reflected the social structure of Viking society. Even during sleep, the hierarchy of the household quietly revealed itself through proximity to warmth and safety. Those who held authority rested closest to the heart of the home, while others adapted to colder corners of the longhouse. Despite these differences, the communal nature of Viking sleep created an environment where individuals remained constantly aware of the presence of others. The gentle movement of someone adjusting their furs, the low murmur of a dream, or the shifting of straw bedding could be heard across the quiet room. In such an environment, people rarely slept deeply for long, uninterrupted stretches. Instead, sleep came in lighter cycles where individuals drifted between rest and awareness throughout the night. Another strange habit recorded in medieval Scandinavian traditions involves the idea of sleeping with weapons nearby. Vikings lived in a time when raids, rival clans, and sudden conflicts were not uncommon. Even inside peaceful settlements, the possibility of attack remained part of life. Because of this, warriors often kept swords, axes, or knives within arm's reach while they slept. These weapons might rest beside the sleeping platform, or even beneath the furs. If danger appeared suddenly, whether from human enemies or wild animals, sleeping warriors could react quickly without searching for their equipment. Archaeological discoveries in Viking graves sometimes reinforce this image. Weapons placed beside the bodies of warriors suggest how closely these tools were connected to daily life. For many Vikings, the boundary between waking and fighting could disappear at any moment. so readiness even during sleep became a practical necessity. The rhythm of sleep also depended heavily on the seasonal cycle of work. During summer months, when daylight lasted nearly the entire night in northern regions, Vikings often reduced the amount of time spent sleeping. Farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trading demanded long hours of labor while the weather remained favorable. People sometimes rested briefly after sunset, and then woke again when the faint glow of dawn returned just a few hours later. Winter, however, created a completely different rhythm. The cold months slowed agricultural work and limited travel across icy landscapes. Nights became much longer, and sleep periods often extended accordingly. Yet even then, Vikings rarely spent the entire dark period asleep. Families gathered around the fire for storytelling, crafting, or preparing tools for the coming seasons before eventually settling into their sleeping areas. Some sagas hint that dreams held particular significance in Viking culture. Dreams were sometimes interpreted as messages or warnings, especially if they involved animals, battles, or encounters with mysterious figures. Norse mythology contained many stories in which dreams foretold events yet to come. Because of this belief, waking during the night to remember or discuss a vivid dream might not have been unusual. A dream could be shared quietly with a family member beside the fire before everyone returned to sleep. The bedding materials themselves added another unusual dimension to Viking sleep. Straw mattresses needed frequent replacement because they gradually became compressed or damp. Families often refreshed bedding with new straw gathered from fields, spreading it beneath wool blankets and furs. Fleas and other insects could sometimes live within these materials, making nighttime rest less comfortable than modern beds. Yet, people adapted to these conditions as part of everyday life. Another subtle habit involved how Vikings oriented themselves while sleeping. In some traditions, individuals preferred sleeping with their heads toward the interior of the house and their feet toward the wall. This arrangement allowed easier movement when rising during the night and prevented cold drafts from striking the upper body directly. Such small details reveal how carefully Viking households adapted their routines to the environment surrounding them. Outside the longhouse, the landscape remained dark and silent. Snow-covered forests stretched across the hills, and icy winds swept across fjords and valleys. Inside, however, the shared warmth of firelight, the presence of family, and the steady breathing of the household created a fragile pocket of comfort against the harsh world beyond the walls. For Vikings, sleep was never completely separate from the demands of survival. It was woven into the rhythms of family life, seasonal labor, spiritual belief, and the constant awareness that the world outside remained unpredictable. Night after night, as the fire glowed softly in the center of the longhouse, generations of Viking families drifted between wakefulness and rest, their strange sleeping habits shaped by one of the most unforgiving environments in medieval Europe. As the Viking night deepened and the fire inside the longhouse slowly burned lower, another unusual feature of Viking sleep became clear. The house itself never truly rested. Even when most of the household had closed their eyes beneath layers of wool and fur, life inside the building continued in quiet movements and shifting sounds. The Viking longhouse was not simply a sleeping place. It was a shelter where work, safety, warmth, and rest all existed together inside the same wooden walls. One reason sleep remained light and often interrupted was the constant responsibility of protecting the household. Viking communities lived in a world where security could never be taken for granted. Rival clans, Wandering raiders, or even wild animals could appear during the night. Because of this, some members of the household, especially experienced warriors, often slept closest to the entrances of the longhouse. From these positions, they could hear the creaking of doors or unusual noises outside before anyone else inside the hall. These men sometimes practiced what historians describe as half-sleep vigilance. Their bodies rested, but their awareness remained sensitive to sudden changes in sound or movement. The smallest disturbance, the bark of a dog, the shift of a horse outside, or the crunch of footsteps in snow, could wake them immediately. In this way, sleep inside a Viking household always carried a quiet readiness for danger. The design of the longhouse also meant that darkness behaved differently inside Viking homes than in modern buildings. After the main fire settled into glowing embers, the only light came from faint flames or small oil lamps placed near important areas of the hall. Shadows stretched along the timber walls and the high roof beams above. As people drifted into sleep, the longhouse became a dim, flickering environment where shapes moved gently as the fire shifted. This dim light actually suited Viking sleep patterns well. Without bright illumination, the body naturally followed the rhythm of darkness and firelight. People fell asleep gradually rather than suddenly, their eyes closing slowly while the quiet sounds of the hall continued around them. Another unusual Viking sleeping habit involved how families organized warmth during the coldest months. Winters in Scandinavia could become brutally cold, especially in regions farther north where icy winds swept across open landscapes. During these nights, families often rearranged sleeping positions so that younger children rested between adults. This arrangement helped conserve heat under shared furs and blankets. The thick animal skins covering the sleeping platforms trapped body warmth and prevented cold air from reaching those beneath them. The clothing Vikings wore to sleep also played a role in their survival during winter nights. Most people did not change into special sleeping garments. Instead, they simply loosened their belts or removed heavy outer cloaks, while keeping wool tunics and trousers on their bodies. Wool retained warmth even when slightly damp and created an extra barrier against the freezing air that sometimes slipped through gaps in the wooden walls. Footwear, however, was usually placed beside the sleeping platform rather than worn during sleep. Boots needed to remain dry and ready for the next morning's work. By placing them near the bed, Vikings ensured they could quickly step into them if they needed to rise suddenly during the night. Interestingly, the Viking relationship with sleep was also influenced by their deep connection to nature and the sky. On clear winter nights, the stars above Scandinavia could appear extraordinarily bright. Occasionally, someone inside the longhouse might step outside briefly, perhaps to check animals or simply to breathe the cold air. Looking upward, they might see the shimmering ribbons of the northern lights moving silently across the sky. These mysterious lights held powerful meaning in Norse belief. Some people believed they represented the glow of armor worn by Valkyries guiding fallen warriors to Valhalla. Experiences like this meant that the boundary between sleep and wakefulness could blur during the Viking night. A person might wake briefly, step outside, witness the strange glow of the sky, and return quietly to their sleeping place beneath the firs. Inside the longhouse, the fire continued its slow burning rhythm. Someone might shift position on the wooden bench. A child might turn in their sleep. The wind might push gently against the turf-covered roof. Yet despite these small movements, the hall remained calm and warm compared to the frozen darkness outside. Over generations, these nightly routines became normal parts of Viking life. Sleeping together in one hall, waking occasionally to tend the fire, adjusting bedding to preserve warmth, and remaining aware of the world beyond the walls, all shaped the strange but practical sleeping habits of the Norse people. For Vikings, sleep was never a perfectly silent or private activity. It was something shared, woven into the life of the household just as strongly as work, storytelling, and survival. Night after night, beneath the heavy beams of their longhouses, Viking families rested together while the cold northern world waited patiently outside until morning returned. As the long nights of the Viking world continued, another strange aspect of Norse sleep slowly reveals itself when historians examine old sagas, archaeological remains, and the structure of Viking homes. Sleep for Vikings was not just about resting the body. It was deeply connected with storytelling, memory, and the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, and many of these activities happened in the quiet hours before people finally drifted into sleep. Inside the longhouse, evenings often stretched for many hours after sunset. With no electricity and very limited light from the central fire, families naturally gathered together in the warmest part of the hall. During these hours, people repaired clothing, sharpened tools, carved wood, or wove wool into cloth. But as the night deepened and the work slowed, the hall became a place for stories. These stories were not simple entertainment. They were the way Viking culture survived. Elders would recount sagas of famous warriors, sea voyages across unknown waters, and the deeds of legendary heroes. Children lying beneath their furs might listen quietly as the voices of older family members echoed softly across the hall. Stories of Odin, Thor, Loki, and the coming of Ragnarok were repeated again and again through generations. In many ways, these nightly storytelling traditions became part of the Viking sleep ritual. Long before anyone closed their eyes, their minds were already drifting into a world of myth and memory. Because of this tradition, sleep often arrived slowly rather than suddenly. People might lie quietly on their sleeping benches listening to the last voices fading across the hall. One person might still whisper part of a story while others had already begun to drift into dreams. The line between storytelling and sleep became blurred, with imagination carrying listeners gently into the night. Another fascinating Viking sleep habit involved dream interpretation. In Norse culture, dreams were sometimes believed to carry messages or warnings. The sagas contain many examples where important dreams were discussed seriously by families or leaders. A dream about a wolf, a raven, or a battle could be interpreted as a sign about future events. Because of this belief, people sometimes woke during the night and shared a dream they had just experienced. Imagine the quiet moment inside a longhouse when someone suddenly sat upright beneath their blankets and whispered about a strange dream they had just seen. Others nearby might listen carefully before encouraging the dreamer to return to sleep. These small nighttime conversations reveal how sleep in Viking culture was not always silent or isolated. It remained connected to the shared life of the household. The temperature of the longhouse also shaped Viking sleeping habits in unusual ways. While the central fire produced warmth, heat did not spread evenly across the entire building. The middle of the hall could feel comfortable, but the ends of the structure sometimes remained cold. During particularly harsh winters, families adapted by moving their sleeping positions closer together near the fire. This meant that sleeping arrangements could shift depending on the season. In summer months, when warmth was less important, people might spread out across the sleeping benches. In winter, the entire household could cluster closer to the center of the building where the fire burned strongest. Another small but interesting Viking habit involved how bedding was maintained each morning. Straw bedding needed regular attention because it compressed and lost its softness over time. After waking, members of the household might shake out blankets and furs to remove dust or insects. Fresh straw could be added beneath the bedding to keep sleeping platforms comfortable and dry. This daily maintenance became part of the rhythm of Viking life. Sleep was not simply something that happened at night. It required preparation and care from the entire household to keep the sleeping environment healthy. Even the smell of the longhouse became part of Viking sleep. The mixture of smoke from the fire, animal skins, wool clothing, and wood created an atmosphere that modern visitors might find overwhelming. Yet for Vikings, this scent meant warmth and safety. It was the smell of home. Children growing up in these houses associated those familiar smells with comfort and protection against the harsh northern world outside. As the night progressed deeper and deeper, the fire gradually burned down to glowing embers. Shadows stretched across the beams of the longhouse roof, and the voices that had once filled the hall disappeared completely. The household slowly settled into a quieter rhythm as sleep spread across the benches along the walls. Outside, snow might fall silently across the fields, or icy winds might sweep across dark forests and frozen rivers. But inside the longhouse, the warmth of shared sleep protected the Viking family through the long northern night. These strange habits, sleeping together in one hall, telling stories before rest, interpreting dreams, adjusting sleeping positions with the seasons, and maintaining bedding each morning, were not unusual to the Vikings themselves. They were simply the natural rhythms of life in a world where survival depended on cooperation, warmth, and the quiet comfort of family gathered beneath one roof. As the Viking night stretched deeper into darkness, another unusual part of Norse sleeping life begins to appear. When historians look closely at daily routines in Scandinavian settlements. Sleep in the Viking world was never completely separated from the rhythm of work, weather, and survival. And the way people rested often depended on what kind of life they lived. Whether they were farmers, fishermen, traders, or warriors preparing for long journeys across the sea. For Viking farmers living in rural settlements, the structure of the year controlled the rhythm of sleep more than any clock ever could. During the busy seasons of spring and summer, daylight in northern Scandinavia could last incredibly long. In the far north, the sun sometimes barely disappeared below the horizon at all. Under these conditions, people often slept for shorter periods, waking early and continuing work long into the evening, while the faint glow of the sky still provided light. Fields needed to be prepared, animals cared for, and fishing boats launched before winds changed or storms arrived. Because work depended on the limited warm months, Vikings adapted their sleep to match the long days of summer. People might fall asleep late at night when the sky was still dimly bright, only to wake again a few hours later when morning light returned. Winter created the opposite experience entirely. Darkness arrived early in the afternoon and stayed until late morning the next day. Instead of the fast rhythm of summer work, winter brought a slower pace to life. During these months, Viking households often experienced longer and deeper sleep cycles, interrupted only by the occasional need to feed animals, adjust the fire, or check the weather outside. For fishermen living along the coasts of Norway and Iceland, sleep followed a completely different pattern. The sea controlled everything. Fishermen often rested when tides allowed or when storms forced boats to remain in harbor. On calm nights, they might sleep briefly before launching boats into the dark waters before dawn. The ability to fall asleep quickly and wake suddenly became an important survival skill for people whose lives depended on the unpredictable ocean. Another strange habit connected to Viking sleep involved the practice of traveling and sleeping in unfamiliar places. Viking traders and warriors frequently moved across large distances, sometimes traveling for weeks or months at a time. When these travelers stopped for the night, they rarely found comfortable houses waiting for them. Instead, they often slept inside temporary shelters, tents, barns, or even directly beside their ships. Longships themselves sometimes became sleeping places. When Viking crews rested during coastal journeys, they could pull their ships onto the shore and sleep beneath wool cloaks or animal skins beside the hull of the vessel. The curved wooden sides of the ship helped block wind, while the group stayed close together for warmth. Sleeping outdoors in this way required another Viking habit: keeping a watch during the night. Someone in the group remained awake while others rested, ensuring that enemies or wild animals could not approach unnoticed. After several hours, the watch would change, allowing another member of the crew to sleep while someone else stayed alert. Even inside permanent settlements, the habit of night watch sometimes continued. In larger villages, people occasionally took turns staying awake during dangerous times, especially if tensions with rival groups were high. This constant awareness of danger meant that Viking sleep was rarely as deep or uninterrupted as modern sleep. The clothing Vikings wore during the day also influenced their nighttime comfort. Most garments were made from wool, which provided excellent insulation against cold temperatures. Instead of changing clothes before bed, many Vikings simply loosened their belts or removed heavy cloaks while keeping their wool tunics on. This allowed them to stay warm without needing separate sleeping garments. Animal skins added another important layer of protection. Furs from sheep, deer, or bear were thick and capable of trapping body heat beneath them. A person wrapped in several layers of fur could remain surprisingly warm, even when the temperature outside dropped well below freezing. Another fascinating detail about Viking sleep appears in the way sound traveled through the longhouse at night. Because the interior was one large open space with wooden walls and beams, small noises carried easily across the hall. The crackle of the fire, the rustling of straw bedding, or the whisper of someone shifting in their sleep could be heard clearly from one end of the house to the other. Yet instead of disturbing people, these sounds often became part of the comforting background of Viking life. Hearing the quiet breathing of family members or the gentle movement of others inside the house reminded people that they were safe within their community. Over centuries, these strange sleeping habits shaped how Viking families experienced the night. Sleep came in waves rather than in a single, uninterrupted stretch. People rested, woke briefly, listened to the sounds of the hall, adjusted the fire or blankets, and then drifted back into dreams again. Inside the longhouse, the warmth of shared living protected them from the brutal northern climate outside. Beyond the wooden walls, the dark Scandinavian landscape remained cold, silent, and unpredictable. But within the hall, the quiet rhythm of Viking sleep continued through the long winter nights. As the Viking household settled deeper into the night, another unusual feature of Norse sleeping life becomes clear when we examine how people protected themselves against the harsh environment of Scandinavia. The Viking world was cold, unpredictable, and often dangerous, and these realities shaped sleeping habits in ways that might seem strange to modern audiences. For Vikings, sleep was never simply rest. It was part of a nightly strategy for staying warm, staying safe, and preparing for whatever the next morning might bring. One important habit involved the careful management of the fire throughout the night. The central hearth inside the longhouse could not be allowed to burn out completely, especially during the brutal winters of the north. Without the warmth of the fire, temperatures inside the house could drop rapidly, turning the hall into a cold and uncomfortable place before morning arrived. Because of this, members of the household often woke briefly during the night to add small pieces of wood or adjust burning logs. This responsibility did not always belong to a single person. Instead, it might pass naturally between individuals who woke during the night. Someone stirring beneath their furs might notice that the fire was fading and quietly step forward to add fuel before returning to their sleeping place. In this way, the household collectively protected its warmth, while the rest of the community continued resting. Another fascinating Viking sleep habit involved using the architecture of the longhouse to trap heat. The thick turf walls surrounding many Scandinavian homes acted as natural insulation against the cold winds outside. The roof, often covered in layers of grass and soil, also helped keep warmth inside the building. As the fire burned throughout the evening, heat slowly filled the hall and remained trapped within the structure. By the time people settled into their sleeping benches along the walls, the interior space could feel surprisingly warm compared to the frozen world outside. Families wrapped themselves in wool blankets and furs, allowing body heat and trapped warmth to maintain a comfortable environment through the night. The sleeping benches themselves were designed carefully for this purpose. Raised slightly above the ground, these wooden platforms kept people away from the cold air that settled along the floor of the building. Beneath the bedding, layers of straw created insulation while animal skins added warmth and softness. Although these sleeping arrangements were simple by modern standards, they represented practical solutions developed over generations of living in cold climates. Every detail, from the position of the benches to the thickness of the bedding, helped Viking families survive the freezing nights of Northern Europe. Another unusual habit connected to Viking sleep involved how people positioned their bodies during rest. Because multiple people shared the same sleeping bench, individuals often slept close together, sometimes even sharing blankets or furs. This arrangement conserved warmth but also meant that people became accustomed to the physical presence of others while sleeping. Children might fall asleep with their heads resting against a parent's shoulder, while siblings shared the same blanket to keep warm. For Vikings, this closeness created a sense of protection. Being surrounded by family members during the night offered comfort against the darkness and cold beyond the walls. The Viking relationship with the night was also influenced by their beliefs about the supernatural world. Norse mythology described many creatures believed to roam during darkness. Spirits, trolls, and mysterious beings said to live in forests or mountains. Although historians debate how literally these stories were believed, such tales certainly shaped the imagination of people living in isolated northern settlements. Because of these beliefs, the night could feel mysterious and powerful. The quiet darkness outside the longhouse sometimes carried a sense that unseen forces might exist beyond the firelight. Inside the hall, however, the presence of family, warmth, and shared space helped push those fears away. Another subtle habit involved how Vikings adjusted their sleeping patterns during storms. Winter storms in Scandinavia could be extremely violent, with powerful winds shaking buildings and snow piling against the walls of houses. During these nights, sleep often became lighter. with people waking occasionally to listen to the strength of the storm outside. Someone might rise briefly to check that the door remained secure or that animals in nearby shelters were safe. Once everything seemed calm again, they would return quietly to their sleeping place beneath the firs. Even the sounds of the Viking night became part of the sleeping experience. The wind moving across the roof, the faint crackling of the fire, the breathing of family members, and sometimes the distant howl of wolves in the forest blended together into a familiar background of sound. Rather than disturbing sleep, these noises became signals of normal life continuing around the household. They reminded everyone that although the outside world remained wild and unpredictable, the longhouse itself remained a place of shelter. In this way, Viking sleep was deeply connected to survival, architecture, family life, and the powerful northern environment that shaped their civilization. Night after night, the same pattern repeated itself. The fire burned low, the hall grew quiet, and the household drifted into rest while the cold Scandinavian darkness surrounded the small wooden building like an endless sea. As the Viking night continued to pass slowly over the cold Scandinavian landscape, another unusual aspect of Norse sleeping life becomes clear when historians study the routines of families living inside these longhouses. Sleep was never simply a private moment for a single individual. Instead, it was something deeply connected to community life, shared responsibility, and the rhythm of the household itself. Inside the longhouse, the arrangement of sleeping spaces created a constant awareness of others, even during the quietest hours of the night. Because dozens of people sometimes slept in the same hall, small movements and sounds naturally traveled across the room. Someone turning beneath their furs, a child shifting on the straw mattress, or the creak of wooden beams as the wind pushed against the roof could be heard by everyone nearby. Rather than disturbing sleep, this constant presence of sound often created a strange sense of comfort. The quiet breathing of family members and the gentle crackling of the hearth reassured everyone that the household remained safe. Silence in the Viking world could sometimes feel more unsettling than noise, especially in isolated settlements surrounded by forests or frozen coastlines. Another fascinating Viking sleep habit involved the practice of sharing dreams and stories when people woke during the night. Because sleep was often broken into segments, it was not unusual for individuals to wake naturally sometime after midnight. During these moments, people might sit quietly for a short time before returning to sleep again. In some households, if someone experienced a vivid dream, they might whisper about it to the person lying beside them. Viking culture placed significant meaning on dreams, believing that they could reveal messages from the gods or hints about future events. A dream about sailing across calm seas, encountering wolves, or seeing distant lands might be remembered and discussed the following day. These nighttime conversations were usually quiet and brief, but they show how sleep in the Viking world remained connected to the shared life of the household, rather than existing as a completely silent activity. The structure of Viking villages also influenced sleeping patterns. In many settlements, houses were built relatively close to one another, forming small clusters of homes around farmland or coastal areas. Dogs often moved between these buildings at night, acting as natural guards against strangers or animals approaching the village. Because of this, people sometimes woke briefly when dogs barked or moved outside. Rather than causing alarm immediately, such sounds usually served as signals that the protective animals were doing their job. Someone might listen carefully for a moment before relaxing again and returning to sleep. The Viking relationship with darkness was also shaped by the natural sky of the far north. Without artificial lights, the night sky above Scandinavia appeared extraordinarily clear. Stars stretched across the darkness in brilliant patterns, and during winter months the northern lights occasionally illuminated the sky with shifting colors. It was not unusual for someone to step outside briefly during the night, perhaps to check animals or simply breathe the cold air, and pause for a moment beneath this vast sky. Seeing the silent movement of the aurora across the heavens could be both beautiful and mysterious, reinforcing Viking beliefs about a universe filled with powerful forces and unseen worlds. Another subtle habit involved preparing the sleeping area before night fully arrived. Families often arranged bedding carefully while the fire still burned brightly in the evening. Furs were spread evenly across the wooden benches, blankets shaken to remove dust or insects, and fresh straw sometimes added beneath the bedding to improve comfort. These small preparations helped ensure that the household would remain warm and comfortable once darkness settled across the land. Because Viking homes lacked the luxury of modern heating systems, proper bedding could make the difference between a tolerable night and an extremely uncomfortable one. Children growing up in these households quickly learned the nightly routines. They understood where their sleeping places were located, how to wrap themselves in blankets to stay warm, and how to move quietly if they woke during the night. Over time, these habits became natural parts of daily life. As the hours passed and the fire slowly turned to glowing embers, the longhouse would settle into a deep calm. The wind might whisper outside the turf-covered walls, but inside the hall, the warmth of shared living continued to protect the sleeping family. Night after night, this pattern repeated across Viking settlements scattered along fjords, valleys, and northern coastlines. Beneath heavy wooden beams and layers of furs, Viking families rested together in a way that may seem strange today but was perfectly suited to the realities of their world. As the Viking night moved toward its deepest hours, the longhouse often entered a strange balance between silence and quiet activity. Although most of the household rested beneath their furs, sleep rarely remained perfectly continuous. Instead, Viking sleep flowed in waves, periods of rest followed by brief moments of wakefulness where someone might shift position, check the fire, or listen carefully to the sounds outside. This pattern was not considered unusual. In fact, it was simply part of life in a world where darkness lasted long and survival depended on awareness. One reason for this unusual rhythm was the absence of artificial light. In modern life, electric lighting allows people to remain active deep into the night while still sleeping a fixed number of hours afterward. Vikings lived in a completely different environment. Once the fire burned low and the last oil lamps dimmed, the longhouse became dark except for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Under these conditions, the human body naturally followed the slow cycle of darkness. Many historians believe that Viking families practiced what is now called segmented sleep. This meant that people often slept in two separate phases rather than one long, uninterrupted period. After several hours of rest, individuals might wake naturally sometime around midnight. During this quiet period, they could sit up briefly, speak softly with someone nearby, or simply watch the dim firelight flicker across the roof beams before eventually drifting back into sleep again. This pattern felt completely normal in medieval societies. The long northern nights of Scandinavia almost encouraged it, with darkness lasting 14 or even 16 hours during winter months. It would have been difficult for anyone to sleep continuously through the entire night. The fire itself often shaped these waking moments. When the flames dropped too low, someone might rise carefully from the sleeping bench and step toward the hearth. Adding a few pieces of wood would restore warmth to the hall. The glow of the flames might briefly illuminate the faces of those sleeping nearby, before the fire settled again into quiet embers. Because the longhouse served as both home and workplace, the fire had to remain alive. Without it, the interior of the house could become dangerously cold before morning arrived. Another curious Viking habit connected to sleep involved listening to the sounds of the outside world. The Scandinavian landscape did not fall completely silent at night. Wind moved through forests and across frozen fields. Snow sometimes slid from the roof with a soft thud. In coastal settlements, waves could be heard striking rocks along the shore. These sounds became part of the Viking sleeping environment. Instead of disturbing people, they formed a familiar background reminding the household of the powerful natural world surrounding them. Occasionally, more dramatic sounds might reach the longhouse. The distant howl of wolves traveling through winter forests could echo across the valleys. Dogs inside the settlement might respond with low barks before settling again. When such moments happened, a few people inside the hall might wake briefly and listen before returning to rest once they realized the animals remained far away. Even the changing seasons influenced how Vikings experienced sleep. During summer, when nights were short and the sky sometimes remained faintly bright, people often rested lightly and woke easily with the early morning light. In winter, when darkness lasted far longer, sleep could stretch deeper and longer as the body responded to the extended night. These seasonal rhythms created a flexible approach to rest rather than the strict sleep schedules common today. Vikings slept when darkness encouraged it and woke naturally when the environment changed around them. Inside the longhouse, the final hours of the night often felt calm and heavy with quiet warmth. The fire glowed softly, the household breathed slowly beneath layers of fur, and the wind outside whispered across the frozen landscape. Gradually, the darkest part of the night would pass. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the first pale hints of morning began to appear, although inside the longhouse most people still rested peacefully. For Viking families, this slow passage of night was as familiar as the rhythm of the sea or the changing of the seasons. Sleep was not a rigid schedule, but a natural flow shaped by darkness, firelight, and the shared life of the household. As the longest hours of the Viking night slowly moved toward morning, another strange detail of Norse sleeping life becomes clear when we study how their daily routines blended naturally with the environment around them. Unlike modern societies where sleep often follows strict schedules determined by clocks, Viking families lived according to the slow rhythm of darkness, firelight, and the changing sky. Because of this, their nights unfolded gradually, rather than following a precise pattern. During the final hours before dawn, the interior of the longhouse usually became extremely quiet. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, spreading a soft red light across the floor of the hall. Thick beams of wood supporting the roof cast long shadows along the walls, while the sleeping benches remained covered with blankets and animal skins, beneath which the household rested. At this stage of the night, many Vikings experienced their deepest sleep, especially after the earlier interruptions that often occurred around midnight. However, even this deep rest rarely lasted until sunrise without interruption. The natural environment surrounding Viking settlements often stirred before morning arrived. Roosters in farmyards sometimes began calling long before daylight appeared. Dogs guarding the settlement might shift restlessly or move between buildings. Horses tied near the houses could stamp their hooves lightly against the frozen ground. These sounds quietly signaled that the long northern night was slowly beginning to end. Inside the longhouse, a few people might begin to wake naturally during this time. Viking sleep cycles were strongly influenced by the faint increase of light that gradually appeared in the sky, even before sunrise. Because longhouses often contained small openings in the roof for smoke to escape, the earliest hint of dawn could sometimes filter gently into the interior of the hall. A person waking during this hour might remain still for a moment beneath their blankets, listening to the slow breathing of the rest of the household and the faint crackling of the dying fire. The air inside the longhouse often felt cooler now that the flames had faded, encouraging someone to rise quietly and place fresh wood into the hearth. As the fire slowly returned to life, warmth began spreading again across the room. This moment marked the transition between night and day in Viking life. There were no alarms or clocks announcing the beginning of morning. Instead, the household gradually stirred as the environment itself changed. The fire brightened, shadows retreated from the walls, and the pale gray light of dawn crept across the wooden beams of the hall. Children might still remain asleep while adults began preparing for the day ahead. Farmers living in rural settlements knew that animals needed attention early in the morning. Sheep and goats required feeding, and horses used for travel or farming needed to be checked. In coastal communities, fishermen sometimes rose even earlier, preparing boats while the sky remained dim so they could reach the best fishing grounds by sunrise. Because of this daily routine, Vikings often developed the habit of waking slowly rather than suddenly. People stretched beneath their blankets, adjusted their clothing, and gradually sat upright along the sleeping benches. Wool garments worn during the night helped protect them from the cold morning air that filled the hall before the fire regained its full strength. Another interesting Viking habit connected to waking involved airing out bedding each morning. After a long night spent beneath furs and blankets, moisture from breathing and body heat could collect within the bedding materials. Families often shook out blankets and lifted furs to allow fresh air to circulate through the sleeping platforms. This simple routine helped keep bedding dry and prevented unpleasant odors from building inside the house. Straw beneath the bedding might also be rearranged or replaced if it had become flattened during the night. Maintaining comfortable sleeping areas was important because these benches served the household every night throughout the year. The morning fire soon became the center of activity again. Cooking pots might be placed over the flames while people warmed themselves before beginning their daily tasks. The quiet stillness of night disappeared as voices returned to the hall, and the household prepared to face the challenges of another day in the harsh northern world. Looking back at these routines, Viking sleep habits appear very different from the modern idea of private bedrooms and uninterrupted rest. Sleep in the Viking world existed within a shared environment shaped by climate, architecture, family life, and the constant presence of nature. Night after night, families rested together along the walls of their longhouses, surrounded by firelight, furs, and the quiet sounds of the settlement around them. Their sleep rose and fell with the rhythm of the northern sky, shaped by darkness in winter and endless daylight in summer. Through centuries of life in Scandinavia, these habits became normal parts of Viking culture, allowing communities to survive the long, cold nights and greet each morning ready for the demands of farming, sailing, trading, or exploration. As the Viking household fully awakened and the longhouse slowly filled with movement, The strange rhythm of their sleep habits began to reveal another important detail that modern life has almost completely forgotten. Sleep for the Vikings was not only about rest during the night, it was deeply connected to how their entire day was structured, especially in a world where physical labor, travel, and harsh weather constantly demanded energy from the body. Unlike modern people who often sit for many hours indoors, Vikings spent most of their waking hours performing difficult physical work. Farmers worked fields, chopped wood, repaired tools, and cared for animals. Fishermen rowed heavy boats through cold seas while managing nets and lines. Craftsmen hammered metal, carved wood, and constructed buildings. Warriors trained with weapons and traveled long distances across rough terrain. Because of this constant effort, the body naturally required moments of recovery throughout the day. Historical evidence suggests that Vikings sometimes practiced short daytime rest periods, especially during darker seasons when sunlight was limited. These moments were not formal naps in the modern sense, but rather quiet pauses where people might sit near the fire, lean against a wall of the longhouse, or briefly close their eyes after completing a demanding task. The idea of resting during daylight was not considered laziness. Instead, it was simply part of maintaining strength for survival in a challenging environment. During winter months, this pattern became even more noticeable. The Scandinavian winter brought extremely short days and long periods of darkness. People often woke later in the morning because sunrise arrived slowly, and evening darkness returned early. As a result, the rhythm of activity shifted naturally with the seasons. Work still needed to be done, but people adjusted their schedules according to the limited daylight available. Inside the longhouse, these seasonal rhythms influenced how people used their sleeping areas as well. The benches lining the walls were not used only at night. During quiet periods of the day, they could also serve as places to sit, repair clothing, carve tools, or rest briefly while listening to stories told by elders. This constant interaction between rest and work created a lifestyle where sleep was flexible rather than strictly controlled. Instead of forcing the body into a fixed 8-hour schedule every night, Vikings allowed their rest to respond to their environment. If a long day of labor demanded more recovery, sleep might begin earlier in the evening. If travelers arrived late or weather forced people to remain awake longer, sleep could shift naturally without strict rules. Another factor that shaped Viking sleep involved their relationship with storytelling and evening gatherings. After the evening meal, families often remained awake for a while near the central hearth. During this time, elders shared stories about past voyages, heroic battles, family history, or the powerful gods of Norse mythology, such as Odin and Thor. These stories served an important purpose. They preserved cultural memory and strengthened the bonds between generations. Children listening to these stories might gradually fall asleep while still wrapped in their blankets near the benches. Adults sometimes remained awake longer, speaking quietly about the day's events or plans for the following morning. Eventually, the fire dimmed and one by one people settled into sleep. Because the entire household rested within the same room, Viking families developed a shared awareness of one another even during sleep. A person turning in their blankets, a child shifting position, or someone rising quietly to add wood to the fire could easily be noticed by others nearby. This closeness created a kind of collective security where the presence of family members offered protection against the dangers of the outside world. It is important to remember that Viking settlements often existed in isolated landscapes where storms, wild animals, and enemy raids could occasionally threaten communities. Sleeping together inside the longhouse meant that if danger appeared, everyone could wake quickly and respond together. Another unusual Viking sleep habit involved the use of heavy fur coverings. Animal skins from sheep, reindeer, or bear were commonly used as blankets because they provided excellent insulation during cold nights. These furs trapped body heat effectively, allowing people to sleep comfortably even when outside temperatures dropped far below freezing. However, these coverings also meant that sleeping could become quite warm near the fire. People sometimes adjusted their blankets during the night, pushing them aside when the heat from the hearth became strong and pulling them closer again as the fire burned lower. The Viking approach to sleep therefore combined several different elements: shared sleeping spaces, flexible rest schedules, seasonal adjustments, and close connection with nature. Their nights were not silent, perfectly controlled environments like modern bedrooms. Instead, they were living spaces where warmth, darkness, family, and survival blended together. Through these patterns, Viking communities managed to endure some of the harshest climates in Europe. Their sleep habits may appear unusual today, but they formed part of a practical system shaped by centuries of experience living in the northern world. As the full picture of Viking sleep slowly comes together, one final detail reveals just how different their nights were from the quiet, isolated bedrooms of the modern world. Sleep in Viking society was never separated from community life, survival, and the powerful forces of nature that surrounded their settlements. Every night inside the longhouse reflected the same reality that shaped their ships, their farms, and their journeys across the seas. Life in the Viking world was shared, practical, and closely tied to the rhythms of the earth itself. The structure of the longhouse played an important role in shaping this experience. These buildings were long wooden halls built to shelter entire families along with workers, travelers, and sometimes even animals during severe winters. Because the roof beams stretched across a single large space rather than dividing the house into many separate rooms, everyone slept within the same environment. The fire burned at the center. Smoke drifted slowly upward toward openings in the roof, and the sleeping benches ran along the walls like a ring surrounding the hearth. At night, the entire household settled into this shared space. The arrangement created a feeling of protection that was essential in a world where danger could arrive suddenly from storms, wild animals, or human enemies. Sleeping together meant that the household functioned almost like a single living organism. If someone woke because of a strange sound outside, others might wake as well. If the fire needed attention, a nearby sleeper could quickly rise to add wood before the hall grew cold. This closeness also meant that sleep was rarely perfectly silent. The sounds of breathing, shifting blankets, quiet murmurs, and crackling firewood formed a natural nighttime atmosphere. Yet instead of disturbing people, these sounds became part of the familiar rhythm of rest. Children grew up hearing these noises every night, learning to fall asleep surrounded by the presence of family. Another fascinating detail about Viking nights involved their relationship with dreams and spiritual beliefs. Norse culture placed great importance on dreams, often viewing them as meaningful messages rather than random images created by the mind. Some dreams were believed to carry warnings, guidance from the gods, or visions connected to future events. Because of this belief, people sometimes shared dreams with family members during the morning meal, discussing what they might mean. Stories recorded in Icelandic sagas describe warriors who dreamed of battles before they occurred. travelers who dreamed of distant lands they would later visit, and individuals who believed that powerful spirits or ancestors appeared during sleep. Whether these dreams were symbolic or simply reflections of daily life, they show how sleep held a deeper cultural significance beyond simple rest. Even the position of the body during sleep sometimes carried meaning. Many Vikings slept lying on their sides wrapped tightly in furs, a position that helped preserve body heat in cold environments. Others rested on their backs near the warmth of the fire. The arrangement of sleeping places often followed a quiet order within the household, where elders or respected family members occupied certain spaces while younger members slept nearby. Over generations, these nightly routines became traditions passed from parents to children. Young Vikings learned early how to prepare bedding, how to keep the fire alive through the night, and how to listen carefully to the sounds of the world outside the longhouse walls. When we look back across the centuries, the sleep habits of the Vikings reveal something deeper than unusual nighttime customs. They show a society that lived in constant harmony with nature's rhythms. Darkness determined when people rested. Fire provided warmth and security. Family created protection. And the changing seasons guided the flow of life from one day to the next. In the modern world, sleep often happens behind closed doors, separated from the wider environment. For the Vikings, however, night was simply another part of life's great cycle, shared with loved ones, shaped by the land, and watched over by the silent northern sky. And so, as the longhouse fire slowly fades into glowing embers and the final Viking voices fall quiet beneath the firs, their strange yet practical sleeping world becomes clear. It was not strange to them at all. It was simply the way people survived, rested and dreamed in one of the harshest yet most fascinating landscapes in human history. If you enjoyed drifting through this calm journey into the strange sleeping habits of the Vikings, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next deep dive into the quiet, mysterious corners of history. There are countless forgotten nights, strange traditions, and hidden stories still waiting to be explored. And somewhere in the darkness of the past,